interviewing Mark Goodrich, who has a wide variety of aviation experiences. Mark, tell us a bit about your early days. What got you interested in aviation?
Joe, I don't think there was a specific event. One of the very interesting stories from my childhood is actually a story from my mother. At the time about which she was speaking when she told this story, we lived on a farm in South Dakota. It was late 1940s. And the way she told the story was that every time an airplane flew over, this little boy in the backyard, who was me, would watch as the airplane went over. And she said that 30 minutes later, I would be looking at the hole in the sky, waiting for that airplane to come back. Clearly there was something in the DNA, because at that point I'd never seen an airplane up close. So,
was any of your family, did they fly? Were they interested in aviation?
My dad had been a pilot during World War II, and actually after the farm, when he was called back for Korea, he continued his flying in the Air Force up until he retired in the mid-1960s or so. But certainly at the time that I first exhibited an interest in aviation, there was no apparent connection with airplanes. It seems to me that just as a matter of DNA and internal programming, I was fascinated by airplanes.
When did you find your way to the airport?
I had my first job at the airport before I was 12, certainly, sometime in the 10 or 11 years of age range. I finally managed, after many tries, to get a job working in the paint shop initially, where my job was to take the paint off of World War II bombing planes, actually, that were being modified as Borate bombers. This was at Merrill Field in Anchorage, Alaska, where we lived at the time. And that, of course, expanded into working in the maintenance facility, helping the mechanics, working on the line, putting gasoline in the airplanes, and otherwise getting the airplanes in and out as they came through for transit fuel services and the like. I did that in exchange for flying lessons, actually, for 4 or 5 years, where the only pay received for that particular work was flying lessons in the E2, and then the J2 and J3 Cubs were the first airplanes.
Well, you went on then to college.
Actually, some of the more interesting experiences of my youth actually happened while I was in high school, because I actually gave up sports the second year of high school because the jobs at the airport had become multiple. At age 14, I began teaching ground schools. I had already passed written examinations, even though I was waiting to get a little older to take some of the flight tests. And the ground schools were instrument ground schools, private ground schools, commercial ground schools. I was teaching ground school 5 or 6 nights a week while I was in high school, and began teaching people to fly. Even before I had an instructor's rating, I became known as the guy around the airport that you could take as a safety pilot if you were practicing instrument procedures. Because I was fairly knowledgeable about the procedures, teaching the ground schools all the time. And I, of course, was doing all of the flying I could do under the radar, since without a commercial license you had to be a little careful about accepting payment. But I was towing gliders at Black Forest Glider Port for a gentleman by the name of Dave Johnson on weekdays when when a lot of the gliding activity was going on for records and the like. Even had the good fortune to tow a record holder at some point in the mid-1960s, as I recall, a gal from Rhodesia who went very, very high, 40-some thousand feet in the glider, and set a record that day. And I turned her loose at about 2,500 feet over Black Forest that morning. I flew for the Forest Service. I had, in fact, one of the jobs that the older pilots didn't like was flying the early morning fire patrols, which for Pike National Forest, they're west of Colorado Springs and Denver. There's a nightly routine where the lightning starts forest fires, and so every morning in those days there was a patrol requirement. Take off from Colorado Springs, fly up to Rawlins, Wyoming, then go back to the second tier and work all the way south to Canyon City. The purpose of that flight was to log and call in the position of the forest fires that had been started overnight. And I got up as a junior in high school. I was getting up every morning at 4 o'clock and flying that 2.5 or 3 hour patrol before I went to high school. This also got me interested in being able to fly a lot of different kinds of airplanes because, of course, working as I did for the Cessna dealer and the Piper dealer, both at that airport, and then flying the military airplanes that were used in the Bore 8 business, flying the early morning fire patrols in the T-34, and then after school in the afternoon going out and operating as a co-pilot initially on the B-18, the B-17, for Bore 8 bombing missions up in the mountains for the fires that ground crews had not been able to put out in the morning. And this was all happening while I was still in high school. At some point, probably during the junior year, I was asked by Piper Distributor up in Denver to, I believe it was Atlas Aviation, it was called in those days, was asked by Atlas Aviation if I would go to Lock Haven, pick a Piper airplane up, and bring it back to Denver, just to ferry a new airplane home, which was very exciting for me because most of my flying had been substantially more local than that. Cross-country flying up to that point was 200 or 300 miles and nothing longer. And this was an opportunity, of course, to fly a couple of thousand miles. So that was very exciting. And it turned out that they were quite satisfied with the work that I did as well because those opportunities began coming up more and more regularly. Before I graduated from high school, I was flying as many of those Piper delivery flights as I could work in to the schedule, including during my senior year of high school, the international checkout for flying the Piper airplanes. And a very interesting thing happened there. I was asked by Piper if I would like to do some international flying, which up to that point I had only flown into Canada, taking Super Cubs, PA-18 model airplanes, which at that point were either 135 or 150 horsepower airplanes, flying them to Alaska, flying them to Canada. Until that time, the ferry flying had been fairly local, that is, cross-country flights of a couple of hundred miles rather than longer distances. So when the opportunity came for a true international checkout, I, of course, jumped at the opportunity immediately, was told that I would take an airplane to Europe and that one of the Piper pilots who had been flying for years for them would give me the international checkout. This was all very exciting stuff. When I showed up at Lock Haven, it turned out that the pilot with whom I was to fly was a gentleman by the name of Max Conrad, who was a very, very famous record holder, had been flying Piper airplanes for many years, had been setting records for flying these airplanes sometimes for 3 and 4 days solo with enormous fuel tanks. He had a Piper Aztec that he had set records all over the world with. And Max Conrad was to be the man to give me the international checkout. I could hardly sleep the night before. This was like a chance to learn the scriptures from Jesus. Max Conrad was just an enormously experienced guy with a very, very large reputation. And the interesting thing was that when we got ready to go, I, of course, had prepared as much as I could for this, had studied, and I showed up. He asked me to show him what I intended to do. I went through the planning. And the irony is, it turns out that Max Conrad was a very, very quiet fellow. He spoke very little. I was told, as a result, to some extent anyway, from an accident he'd had back in the 1930s or 40s when he was actually hit in the head by a propeller. You could still see the scar on his head. But he was a very quiet fellow. We're together and flew together for 2 days from Lock Haven up across the North Atlantic and into Brussels with this airplane. I can't tell you now whether it was an Aztec or a Twin Comanche, but it was one of those two airplanes. And he must have said like maybe 100 words to me in 3 days. It was very, very little conversation. So that part was a little disappointing. I was expecting to have him talking continuously and passing along all these pearls of wisdom. But that may also have been a result of the fact that I had been doing so much work preparing for the flight, and I think things actually were prepared fairly well. That, of course, created the opportunity then to expand the ferry flying for Piper into international flying. So even before I got out of high school, I was essentially flying around the world on as regular a basis as I could work in. You asked about going to college then, and I had a very unique opportunity in college. I had an opportunity to get a scholarship with NASA, who at the time had a program that they called, I think, a cooperative program. And the idea was that you would go to aerospace engineering school for 1 semester, and then you went and worked for NASA for a semester. Then you went back to aerospace engineering school and the like. There was some credit given for the time that you spent working for NASA, and so it wasn't a total waste in terms of college credits, but it did stretch a program out from a 4-year program to, I think, even 5 years with summers, because there was no vacation if you were on this program. You were doing something 4 quarters a year or 3 semesters a year. The college that I selected, I was actually given 3 different colleges from which I could select. The one I selected was on a quarter system, so I had 4 quarters a year rather than 3 semesters. And the reason I selected it was because the opportunity there existed to do all of the flight test work on the student projects. There were a number of surplus military airplanes that the college had been given or had acquired for purposes of the aeronautical engineering department, and they had no wind tunnel other than the very small ones we used for the micro experiments. So most of the projects that were done were actually done by setting up one of the airplanes, tufting it or modifying it in some way, and then going out and recording, often with high-speed 500 frame per second film. We would be recording the reactions over parts of the airfoil and the like. So this was an opportunity for me to be the flight test pilot for the program, which was hard to turn down. So that created the opportunity then to work with NASA and also to work on my aerospace engineering degree. Unfortunately, the timing was not real good, and after about 3 years of that program, the program went away. We were told, and I believe it to be true, that there just was no funding. There was quite an effort at that time for the Apollo program to put men on the moon, which was to happen a couple of years later, 3 years later. And essentially all the money for Dryden and for the Edwards Air Force Base facility dried up on the aeronautical side of things, and if you wanted a career in NASA, it was pretty clear that you were going to have to move into the space program, which I had virtually no interest in doing whatsoever. So at that point, I elected to switch my direction somewhat, and the last year or year and a half of college actually went into the fixed base operation business. Ultimately, about the time I graduated from college, taking over the lease at the local airport in Ames, Iowa, and becoming a fixed base operator. We were dealers and or distributors for a variety of the airplanes that were then being sold. Those airplane lines included the Piper line and the Cessna line. We actually had two airports in close proximity. One was a Cessna and one was a Piper dealership. We had the opportunity to sell all of the airplanes manufactured by both of those manufacturers, and this created the opportunity to get into some associated businesses as well. For example, the agricultural application business, which was very large in the central part of the country. And I became, over the next 2 or 3 years, a major figure in the marketing and the operation of Cessna's ag wagon and ag truck airplanes, which were very good airplanes for agricultural application. They were really the first airplanes in the agricultural business that were all metal. They had good capacity. The airplanes were new. They were not old modified trainer planes, which up until that point we had been primarily using to spray. It also gave me the opportunity to get into the flight training business, the charter business. In those days, the late 1960s, up until sometime in the late 1970s, the general aviation business in the United States was very, very strong business. Airplanes were being manufactured at enormous rates. The Cessna organization, by the mid-1970s, was producing between 8,000 and 10,000 airplanes a year. And over the next several years, our business, our fixed-base business, expanded ultimately out to include about 13 separate business entities, certified repair stations, the operation of the airports themselves, flight training schools. We had one of the very first operations in the United States to certify under what was then a brand new flight training section of the regulations, the Part 141 Certified Flight School. We had Part 145 repair stations at 2 of our facilities, 2 separate airports, ultimately 3 airports, 2 to begin with. And we, of course, had the agricultural application business. We had a parts distribution business. And, of course, we had the additional airplanes because we began picking up other lines. The Belanca, which at that point was being made in Alexandria, Minnesota. They were producing the Belanca Viking. And associated with them was the Champion Aircraft Company, which was in Wisconsin. And they were manufacturing the Citabria line, a small tandem arrangement, conventional gear, airplanes from the 7 ECA, which was about 115 horsepower, up through the 8 KCABs, and that was being touted by them as an aerobatic trainer. Also the Scout. And the Scout airplane was an 8 series airplane that was set up as a spray airplane as well. Wasn't as good as the Cessna sprayers. We never actually used any of them to spray, but we were distributors for the product. We also were a Mooney distributor for several states through the Middle West, and became a very, very large presence in the Mooney operation for the years from about 1967 or 68 through sometime in the early 1970s. We were selling about 1 new Mooney every other week, picking 26 of them a year up for several years from Mooney. And distributing, I think we had territories that went over about 5 of the Middle Western states to sell and service those Mooney airplanes. That ceased at some time in the early 1970s when the Mooney organization was bought and sold several times by different operations, and there was a period of time when they just were no longer being manufactured there, or at least manufactured in a way that you could predict. We also had the Hughes helicopter distributorship. Hughes at that point was making the Model 269, which was a reciprocating powered helicopter. As I recall, a 290 horsepower helicopter, 2-place. Very interesting helicopter in that it was a very low mass helicopter and also had a low energy rotor system, and created the opportunity to see all of the very worst that one could see about helicopters packaged into one unit. The helicopter was extremely hazardous to fly in the event of any power interruption. And we quickly determined that we did not want to use that airplane for training purposes. It was easy for the most experienced pilot to get in trouble with a 269 with any power failure whatsoever. At the time between an engine failure and loss of control was something on the order of 1 second. So if you simply were tuning a radio at the moment of engine failure, you probably would not have the time to put your hand back on the collective, lower it enough to maintain the airflow across the rotor. You probably would separate the airflow. Hughes also made at that time the 369, which was a turbine-powered helicopter. The military at that time was calling it, I think, the 06, a Loach. And that was a helicopter that shared some of those characteristics in that it was also low energy, but of course the power plant was more reliable because it was a turbine-powered helicopter. And in addition to that, we had the Bell Service Center to take care of the Bell, principally Model 47s at that time. The 205, 206 series helicopters were then still being manufactured exclusively for the military. So in the Bell business, civilian markets, it was the Bell 47. And that was a very good training helicopter, had a very high energy rotor, even though it was a light helicopter, and was also very good for spray purposes. And we used that helicopter for agricultural application at some of our spray operations scattered around the Middle West. It was very good for working the smaller fields. At the midpoint in the 1970s, it became very clear to me that the general aviation business was in trouble. And I determined at that point that I was going to get out of the general aviation business. We were, at that point, one of the largest Cessna dealers in the country. I was personally on what they called a dealer committee. This was a committee of people who owned and operated the Cessna dealerships around the world, which, as a relatively small group, sold the bulk of the airplanes. And was also, of course, a relatively strong figure in the used airplane market. If you're selling that many new airplanes, you see a lot of used airplanes. And there were several years during the middle of the 1970s when, between new and used airplanes, we had around 500 airplanes a year going through our operation. Full-time sales department and a lot of activity. But it was very clear to me that the manufacturers had made some real serious mistakes just in terms of their business planning. Cessna had announced that it would build 10,000 airplanes a year by '77. There were some very interesting tax advantages at the time that had been created by the government to interest businesses in buying equipment, investment tax credits, bottom line deductions of up to 10%. And the manufacturers, principally Cessna and to a somewhat lesser extent Piper, were promoting the sale of airplanes based on tax benefits rather than based on a need by people for airplanes. And what had happened over the 1970s was that doctors and dentists and lawyers and Indian chiefs had all acquired airplanes for tax reasons that were not, and these airplanes were not being flown. They were essentially sitting in T-hangars all over the United States. The market had been overstuffed with airplanes. And the manufacturers were coming upon a very difficult decision in terms of how they were going to continue to expand the pyramid scheme that they had built around manufacturing, or find some way to escape. It was unfortunate the way things went there because despite the fact that they had no legal problems, in fact, the manufacturers decided they would rally around. They were going to have to cease production, not because of their own mismanagement, but because they were being sued. And that was a very easy story to sell. And I can state unequivocally, absolutely, as a guy on the inside, that that was just a total facade that was created only to escape with some political cover this incredibly bad situation that they had created by overproduction of their airplanes. Because I saw this coming, I made the decision to get out of the business, and did over the next several years. We had some very tough times during that period when Nixon was first elected. We had the so-called Arab oil embargo, which created a very difficult year or two for us. New Department of Energy had been formed. The United States government essentially came in and said, you will be allowed, starting tomorrow, to have 7% of the fuel that you purchased 1 year ago. And over the next few months, we were able to obtain some exemptions for agricultural application, for the charter business, and so forth. But it was devastating for the fixed base operation business to suddenly not be able to get gas. We were able to deal with some of this by essentially buying smuggled gas. There was lots of fuel available in Canada, and there were operators in Canada who would bring truckloads of fuel down for us at a premium price, but it was simply unobtainable in the United States. And once again, this was pretty much a political matter. Although the United States government was telling everyone fuel wasn't available, there was fuel available every place in the world except the United States. So I'm personally convinced, having flown over the Gulf of Mexico that summer of '73, that what was really going on was that the Nixon administration and their buddies in the oil business were increasing consumer expectations as to the price per gallon that had to be paid in the United States. There were tankers full of fuel in the Gulf of Mexico loaded.
Your ferry business has evolved around to a job of a lot of repossessions from airlines and so forth.
Repossessions and deliveries, as well as a lot of required flight test work in conjunction with that. As I explained earlier, the business, the flight test business, which ran as an independent entity for many, many years, doing flight test work for manufacturers and for governments, for government agencies, not just for the FAA, although sometimes for them, but also for NASA, for the NTSB, and for others over the years, different projects, different components, and certainly for airlines and airplane modifiers, doing STC, in some cases certification work for surplus military airplanes, which had not previously had a civilian type certificate, doing supplemental type certificates where different engines were added, additional fuel tanks were added, modern navigational, the wingtips, the blended wingtips, which are the current marketing craze, and doing flight test work in a broad variety of ways, and with airplane types all the way from the DC-9, 737, the smallest of the transport category jets, up through the very largest, the MD-11 and 747-400s. The flight test business essentially ran a separate track for many years. The ferry business was one component, the flight test business was another component. But over the past 5 years or so, starting sometime in the late 1990s, early 2000s here, the two have become essentially a single business, because the airlines no longer own their airplanes by and large. The airplanes are owned by leasing companies and by banks. Leasing companies and banks, unlike airlines, have no operational component. Therefore, they are not really able to either move their own airplanes, certainly not able to do tests on their airplanes. And this all happens at a time when the airline business has essentially run itself into the ground. And I use those words very advisedly. The current perception in 2004 is that somehow world terrorism has created a real problem for the airlines. Um, I was preaching the impending doom that we're experiencing now in the airline business 20 years ago. This is, in my judgment, entirely a function of the airline deregulation craze that swept the country in the early 1980s. Terrorism is no more significant to this problem today than increases in fuel prices or many other things that affect the airline business in one or more small ways. What's happened is the airlines have essentially run themselves into the ground financially. There's no equity in the airlines. Their airplanes are owned by other people, and indeed the other people who own their airplanes don't know anything about airplanes. They're bankers. And this has created for our business an opportunity because certainly when a bank owns 400 or 500 airline transport airplanes, and many of them do, some of the leasing companies own as many as 1,000 right now, airline airplanes. It's necessary for them to hire the assistants to move the airplanes, to put flight testing on the airplanes, determine their condition, validate their condition out of maintenance, and so forth. And so this business has become, over the last 5 years or so, one where we spend most of our time either repossessing airplanes when an airline in some part of the world has failed to make its payments, delivering an airplane to an airline which has agreed to lease it, doing test flying as the airplane comes out of maintenance and before it's delivered, or doing the return evaluation, which is also a test flight of sorts, because under most lease agreements the airline is obligated to return the airplane in substantially the same condition as which it was received at the start of the lease, and therefore it requires a test flight in order to validate that all of the equipment and systems on the airplane are operational. And oftentimes these things get done in conjunction. That is, we will go to some country in the world to pick up an airplane. We'll put the return acceptance test flight on it with the crew there, and then fly the airplane to a maintenance facility somewhere else in the world. A few weeks later, we'll go do the post-maintenance flight test and then take it to some other location in the world, deliver it to the next airline customer, at which point we do the acceptance flight test. So we might test the same airplane 2 or 3 times between it coming from the prior lessee going to the next subsequent lessee, and that will include ferry flights to and from a maintenance facility. Another feature of what's happened in this large airplane business is that maintenance has become very much a third world enterprise, and I don't mean third world in the context of not within the United States, because many of the third world maintenance facilities are indeed in the United States, where we have maintenance facilities now springing up at abandoned air bases around the United States for the specific purpose of working on large airplanes. A gathering cloud for the large airplane business is the quality of the maintenance that's being performed, not only within the United States, but indeed around the world. We now have maintenance facilities in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, in Tel Aviv, in Brindisi, and in Napoli, and in Venice, in Lagos in Nigeria, in Rio de Janeiro, in Costa Rica, in San Salvador, in Oscoda, Michigan, in Mobile, Alabama, all over the world, maintenance facilities which have sprung up with, in my judgment, insufficient attention paid to the job that they're actually able to do. Unfortunately, in today's world, the focus has become getting a check mark in the box saying the maintenance has been done rather than actually doing the maintenance. And believe me, I see this day in and day out, taking airplanes into maintenance, reporting work that needs to be done, and then picking them back up a few weeks later. I can tell you that the worldwide status of airplane maintenance is deteriorating significantly, from the biggest airlines to the smallest airlines. And very much unlike what I believe to be the public perception, this is not restricted to small airlines in Africa or carriers who may be small within even developed countries. This is broad and general and applies to airlines large and small everywhere.
The maintenance in this country is not any better than some of the others then.
That's absolutely true. There is a group of, I suppose you would call it gypsies, who move around from facility to facility. These facilities, therefore, have staff that changes constantly. They are started and operated by companies that put as little money as possible into obtaining a lease on a former airbase. Very little in the way of parts support, very little in the way of documentation support. It is a weekly occurrence for me to be somewhere at a maintenance base and to have this operation performing maintenance on a 747, a 757, a 767, a DC-10, MD-11, an Airbus, and they have essentially no manuals whatsoever with which to work. They're shooting from the hip. I see a lot of parts replacement rather than bona fide troubleshooting, where I will show up to pick up an airplane that I left a few weeks before. I will immediately go to the issues that were raised when we brought it in about a defective system. I will find that they have replaced $200,000 or $300,000 worth of parts but done no troubleshooting in order to determine that the parts that have been replaced are actually the problem. And after $300,000 worth of parts have gone into the system, I point out that the system is still not operational. It turns out the mechanics there don't even know how to test the system. Because it's an electronic airplane, they don't have experience, they don't have manuals, they don't have test equipment and the like, and it ends up being a $25 switch, $300,000 worth of parts into the situation. That situation arises so often that it would be impossible for me to overemphasize that as a problem. It is a regular part of what has happened to airplane maintenance in the deregulated airline environment.
Well, this was one of my big complaints, that the airlines did away, just didn't hire A&E mechanics anymore. They're looking for people with less experience, that they pay less money.
Yeah, it's very, very price driven, which is unfortunate. The argument that was made when the Airline Deregulation Act passed was, we can allow free market forces to work and we can still keep safety as our priority. Well, unfortunately, that's not the way it works. If free market forces are going to work and the lowest possible cost ticket becomes your goal, then you're not going to maintain safety at those levels. And I see this in a variety of ways, maintenance and flight operations both, even the selection of airplanes, the selection of equipment on the airplanes. Because the people making decisions about airplane maintenance are more accountants than they are maintenance people, they tend not to see maintenance as an investment, but rather as only an expense on the books this quarter and this year. I have said as a consultant to many airline people that sending the airplane to Ethiopia to save $600,000 on a check on a maintenance inspection just means that the next one will cost $3 million more. They do not understand how maintenance problems are carried forward. They truly believe that the check mark that says the inspection has been done is exactly the same no matter where you get it or how you get it. And this is very, very much driven by their cost of capital considerations. I see the same thing in the airplane setups. I'll see airplanes being delivered as brand new airplanes without fundamentally important equipment. The reason they're being delivered that way is because of the purchasers at the banks or the finance companies and the leasing companies don't know what to put on the airplane. They're not operationally knowledgeable. So what they do is try to reduce the original price as much as possible. The airline that's going to lease the airplane doesn't have money. If it did, it would be buying its own airplanes. It's looking for a leasing company that will give it an airplane. And if indeed the airplane that is available doesn't really fit in terms of equipment, they will simply make the accommodation, accept the airplane anyway, because it's what is available. And so this overemphasis on the price of things ultimately, in my judgment, both degrades the safety of the overall operation, but also does not ultimately save money. The money is spent in different ways. The money that is spent is not apparent to the accountants who are now running the airlines, and I mean from the very highest positions in the airlines. It certainly is not apparent to the leasing companies. And yet, at the end of the day, they are not saving money. They're merely moving it around, putting it under a different walnut shell so that you can't see it today,